Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
Close your eyes for a moment. Picture a world that has not known the warmth of organic feet for 60 million years. A world where the sky is a bruised and breathless violet, scarred by strange geometric structures that rise from the desert floor like the bones of something impossibly vast. There is no wind, not really. Only the slow exhalation of a planet that has forgotten what it means to be alive. The ground is dust the color of oxidized copper. The silence is total. And yet, beneath your feet, beneath kilometers of ancient rock and compressed geological time, something is moving. It is patient. It is old in ways that make your species look like a mayfly that hatched this morning. And it has been waiting. Welcome to Q on 40k. Tonight, we are going somewhere very few people have ever truly explored. Somewhere that requires us to stretch our imagination across timescales that no organic mind was naturally designed to comprehend. Or we are going deep into the most ancient, most storied kind of place in all the Warhammer 40,000 galaxy. We are going to a Necron crown world, the very oldest and most exalted category of tomb world that exists. And we are going to ask a question that sounds almost absurdly simple, but turns out to have one of the most fascinating, most melancholy, and most genuinely haunting answers in all of 40k lore. What is life actually like there? What is it like to be a Necron in that place? What does it feel like to exist inside those ancient halls? To walk those corridors that have not heard living footsteps in geological epochs? What does the hierarchy look like? And who holds power? And what do they do with it? And what do they want? What strange systems keep these worlds functioning across ages of time that dwarf the entire recorded history of humanity? What madnesses have taken root in the long dark, growing slowly through the eons like roots cracking stone? And what does it mean when, after 60 million years of silence, the lights start coming back on, and something deeply, terrifyingly ancient opens its eyes? These are the questions we are going to sit with tonight, and I want you to get comfortable. Because this is one of those lore dives where we are not skimming the surface. We are going all the way down. We are going to the bottom of this, through layer after layer of history and philosophy, and the sheer strange weight of deep time, until we understand what a Necron crown world really is. Not just as a game mechanic, not just as a dramatic backdrop for a cool battle report, but as a place, a living, or rather an unliving, breathing, or rather mechanically cycling world with its own rhythms and hierarchies and tragedies and terrible beauty. Let us begin at the very beginning. And for the Necrons, the beginning is almost incomprehensibly far back. Part 1. Before the metal, who were the Necron? And every story about the Necrons is, at its root, a story about something that was lost. A civilization that traded its soul for its survival. A people who wanted so desperately to live that they agreed to a price they did not fully understand until it was already paid, and have been reckoning with that price ever since. But to understand what was lost, you have to understand what existed before the loss, and what existed before the Necrons were the Necron. Say that name quietly to yourself, a Necron. There is something almost plaintive about it, something that sounds like a people who always knew they were going to suffer. And they did. They suffered from the very first moment their civilization drew breath. The Necron evolved on a world that hated them. Their home star was a blazing, radiation-saturated thing, not the warm, life-giving kind of star that nurtures complex biology, but a volatile, a howling furnace that bathed its system in hard radiation and electromagnetic punishment on a continuous, relentless basis. The Necron were, from their earliest days, a people being slowly and continuously killed by their own sun. Their biological forms were frail. Their lives were short. Cancer was not a disease among the Necron the way it is conceptualized in modern human medicine, as something that befalls some people at some times. For the Necron, malignancy was universal. It was the background radiation of existence itself, Every single one of them was living with it, fighting it, dying from it, watching their children waste away from it before they reached what other species might have called middle age. Think carefully about what that does to a civilization over long spans of time. A people shaped not by abundance or security, but by constant, intimate, personal suffering, build a very particular kind of culture. They build one that is, by necessity, deeply focused on death. Not because they are morbid or theatrical about it, but because death is simply so present in their daily experience that to ignore it would be a kind of willful delusion. The Necron became, almost inevitably, a species obsessed with mortality and what lay beyond it. Their architecture reflected this. Their philosophy reflected this. Their art and their religion and their politics all reflected this. When the Necron built monuments, but they built monuments to the dead. When they prayed for more time. When they gathered in their cities, the cities were always shadowed by the awareness that the people in them would not be there for long. Their family structures were shaped by it. Their political dynasties were shaped by it. The fact that a Necron ruler might die of cancer before finishing a project meant that dynastic continuity was constantly under threat. That power changed hands with a frequency that drove constant instability. Their wars of secession, the periodic fracturings of the Necron Empire into competing factions that kept their civilization from achieving the unity it might otherwise have managed, were partly a function of this instability. Dynasties that could not pass their power to reliable successors because their rulers kept dying young, could not maintain the consistent long-term strategies needed for genuine imperial stability. And yet the Necron developed space travel, which is itself a remarkable testimony to what a determined and intelligent species can achieve even under conditions of brutal biological hostility. They spread across the stars. As they built colonies and empires and dynasties on worlds beyond their dying sun's reach, the Necron became a galactic power, spreading their civilization across the stars with the driven energy of a people for whom every day of survival felt like a victory against the forces arrayed against them. They were extraordinary in their way, a people that brilliant and that tenacious, shaped by that level of constant adversity, develops a particular quality of stubborn, yet determined brilliance that is genuinely rare in the long catalogue of galactic civilizations. But the cancer followed them. However far they travelled, however many worlds they colonized, the Necron could not escape the fundamental biological fragility that their origin world had bequeathed them. Radiation was one thing. You could live on worlds with kinder stars, but the core fragility was written into their genetics, get into the fundamental structure of the biological machinery of life as the Necron instantiated it. They aged, they suffered, they died. And the worst part, the part that gnawed at the Necron collective psyche with a persistence that would eventually reshape the entire galaxy, was that they knew other things did not have to live this way. In the deep antiquity of the galaxy, far older than any mortal reckoning, there existed beings known as the Old Ones. And if the Necron were a fire that burned hot and brief, the Old Ones were geological formations, vast, impossibly slow, impossibly ancient, possessed of lifespans that made the age of star systems seem like an afternoon. The Old Ones were not simply long-lived, they were functionally immortal in any meaningful practical sense. They had mastered the warp, the churning psychic dimension that underlies all of material reality, and through that mastery, they had achieved things that looked to other species like pure, unmediated divinity. They seeded worlds with life, tailoring the conditions for biological complexity to emerge from raw chemistry. They built the webway, that miraculous, dimension-spanning network of corridors through space that allowed travel without the terrors of the open immaterium. They were stewards of an entire galaxy, moving through it on timescales so vast that the rise and fall of civilizations might register to them the way seasons register to a human. And the Necron begged them for help. The historical records are fragmentary, contradictory in places. and filtered through millions of years of imperfect preservation. But the broad shape of what happened is clear enough. The Necrontyr, as encountering the Old Ones and recognizing what they represented, recognizing that here were beings who had solved the problem that was killing the Necrontyr civilization, asked those ancient entities to share the secret of their longevity. They asked for access to the gift that would end their suffering. They asked for more time. They asked, in the most fundamental sense, that any species can ask anything to live. The Old Ones said no. We do not know with any certainty why. Well, there are theories. Perhaps the Old Ones believed that to grant immortality to a young species still working through its formative conflicts would be dangerous. That a civilization needed to pass through the crucible of mortality before it could be trusted with eternity. Perhaps they feared what the Necrontyr might become with unlimited time at their disposal. But perhaps there were metaphysical conditions, something about the relationship between the warp and biological consciousness, that made the transfer impossible without specific prerequisites. Perhaps the Old Ones were simply arrogant in the way that all beings of extraordinary power eventually become arrogant, and did not feel they owed any explanation to the shorter-lived species asking at their doorstep. The reason ultimately does not matter for what happened next. What matters is the response. The Necrontyr took the rejection as a wound that would never close. Think about what that refusal must have felt like at the level of civilizational experience. To have spent your entire existence watching your people die young, in pain, one after another, with the constant grinding awareness that there were beings in the same galaxy who could have helped and chose not to. But there are few things more radicalizing in a culture's history than the moment when they reach out to the powerful for mercy and receive only silence, only dismissal, only the clear communication that their suffering is not the powerful being's problem. The bitterness that took root in the Necrontyr civilization in the aftermath of that refusal was not a passing resentment or a temporary political grievance. It became something structural, something constitutional. Or it was wired into how they saw themselves and how they saw everyone else. This bitterness found its most destructive expression in what became known as the War in Heaven, which is, in a very real sense, the most significant event in the entire history of the Warhammer 40,000 galaxy. It predates humanity's emergence as a recognizable species by tens of millions of years. It made the universe that everything else in 40k inhabits. Every war, every culture, every faction, and every plot point in the setting exists in the shadow of what happened in that ancient catastrophic conflict. And it began because a dying people, seething with accumulated grief and bottomless resentment, looked at the beings who refused to save them and decided that if they could not have immortality, they would make the Old Ones understand what it meant to suffer. But to fight the Old Ones, the architects of life itself, the masters of the psychic dimension that permeates all of reality, the Necrontyr would need help. Terrible, ancient, profoundly dangerous help. And they would find it eventually in the worst possible place imaginable. Because somewhere out there in the dark between the stars, near the dying of ancient suns, things were stirring. Things that had been there since before the Necrontyr drew their first collective breath. Things that were not biological. Things that had no concept of mercy, or morality, or compassion, because they had never possessed anything close to it. Things that were, in a very literal sense, as old as the physical universe. The Satan were coming, and the Necrontyr, in their desperation, would invite them in. Part 2. The Bargain. Biotransference. And the price of forever. The Satan are what happens when consciousness and hunger exist without the restraining architecture of organic needs or social bonds or any of the other pressures that shape the psychology of beings who evolved as part of a biological ecosystem. They are, in their natural form, beings of pure living energy, vast intelligences that spread themselves across the surfaces of stars and fed upon the electromagnetic radiation those stars produced. They were ancient when the Necron were microbes. They predated the old ones. They are, in the cosmology of Warhammer 40,000, among the few things that can honestly claim to be truly primordial. Entities present since the earliest formation of the physical universe. Over the incomprehensible span of their existence, the C'tan had changed in a very particular direction. They had developed taste. They had discovered that the simple electromagnetic radiation of stellar fusion was, if not exactly boring, then certainly less interesting than another kind of energy entirely. The energy of living things. The spark that separates animate matter from mere rock and gas. The metaphysical dimension of life. The soul essence that organic beings carry within them without ever being truly aware of how valuable it is. But the C'tan, once they had encountered organic life, found it irresistible, not metaphorically but as a literal drive written into their fundamental nature. They craved it, they needed it, and they were very, very patient in obtaining what they needed. The Necron, in their desperation, found the C'tan, or the C'tan found the Necron. There are multiple accounts, and none of them are entirely credible. What we know is that contact was established, and the C'tan, recognizing in the Necron a tool that might serve their deeper purposes, presented them with an offer that must have seemed like the answer to every prayer the Necron had ever raised to whatever cold gods they worshipped in their brief, radiation-soaked lives. Immortality, not the metaphorical kind, not the survival through legacy kind that mortal beings console themselves with when they look at the short span of years available to them, but real, genuine, physical immortality. Bodies that would not age, would not sicken, would not decay under any ordinary circumstances. Bodies forged from a miraculous substance called necrodermis, a living metal that could repair itself, reshape itself, withstand the worst that the physical universe could throw at it, and simply knit back together. The Necron could have what the old ones had refused them. They could have forever. The price, the C'tan explained, was simply the biological form they already occupied. Those frail, cancer-ridden, short-lived bodies that caused them so much suffering. They would need to transfer their consciousness into these new metal shells. The process was called biotransference. The colossal industrial machinery required to perform it, vast roaring biofurnaces that would be constructed on a planetary scale, was already being designed. And through the genius of a cryptech named Illuminor Ceras, the greatest technical mind the Necron ever produced, the engineering was made real. The Necron, at enormous cost and effort, agreed. They debated it. They agonized over it. Some factions resisted bitterly and had to be compelled by force. Ghost arcs, carrying those who refused, their limbs broken, to the furnaces to be processed, regardless of their wishes. But in the end, they agreed. The species as a whole marched into the machines. What happened inside those furnaces is not something that was, or perhaps could be, fully recorded. The details that survive suggest an ordeal on a species-wide scale that is almost too large to hold in the imagination. The biofurnaces roared day and night without ceasing. Into them marched the Necron, one dynasty at a time, their biological forms fed into the machinery. And out of those machines came something else, something that wore their shapes, that carried the residue of their personalities, that remembered, after a fashion, who it had once been. Something immortal, exactly as promised, something that had lost its soul, because the C'tan were hovering above those furnaces during the entire process, enormous and ethereal and utterly without mercy. And what the furnaces burned away from each Necron body, the spiritual, metaphysical, psychic essence that constituted what they truly were as living beings, what the thing that would have connected them to the warp in the way that all biological consciousness connects to the warp, drifted upward from the machinery like smoke. And the C'tan consumed it, every single soul, an entire species, devoured one at a time. By the time the Silent King, Sarek of the Sarkhan dynasty, emerged from his own biotransference and looked at what had become of his people, the scale of what had been done hit him like a physical blow. He had made a terrible mistake. Not simply the mistake of trusting beings whose nature he could not fully comprehend. That, perhaps, was understandable. The mistake was deeper. He had consented, on behalf of an entire species, to a trade that those people had not fully understood, could not have fully understood, because the Satan had never explained the full cost. The immortality was real. The bodies were exactly as promised. The Necrons, as the transformed Necrontyre now were, would not age, would not succumb to disease, could regenerate from almost any wound. Their new forms were everything the Satan had said they would be, but the fullness of who the Necrontyre had been was gone, not entirely and not equally. The noble classes, those of the highest rank, had been given bodies with sufficiently dense and complex cognitive architecture to retain something like genuine personhood. Overlords and lords and pharaohs retained their memories, their personalities, their eccentricities and ambitions and desires in something resembling their original form. But even they felt the absence. There was a hollowness in the self that no amount of analytical processing could fill. A place where something had been that was now simply not there. An emptiness that had no name because the Necrons had been stripped of so much of the inner life that would have allowed them to articulate what they had lost. And for the lower ranks, the warriors, the common soldiery, whilst the rank and file of the great dynasties, the situation was far worse. Those bodies had been constructed with only the minimum cognitive complexity needed for function, for obedience, for following orders. The consciousness that inhabited them was a dim ghost of what had walked into the furnace. They were not, in any meaningful sense, people anymore. They were automata that remembered, in the vaguest and most distant way, that they had once been something else. They would fight. They would march. They would endure. But they would not truly think, not truly feel, not truly be in the way that any biological being takes for granted as the baseline of existence. This is the tragedy at the heart of every Necron tomb world. Not the military might, not the political intrigue, not even the madnesses that grow in the long dark of the Great Sleep. The fundamental tragedy is this. A people who wanted to live forever got exactly what they asked for, and found that what they received was not what they had wanted at all. Zarek understood this. He gathered his broken people, focused their cold mechanical rage on the gods who had deceived them, and built weapons of unimaginable power in secret. When the old ones were finally broken and scattered, and the war in heaven ground toward its terrible conclusion, the Silent King turned those weapons on the Satan themselves. He killed his gods, not all of them, and not permanently. The Satan was so fundamentally woven into the fabric of physical reality that true extinction was beyond even the power of the weapons Zarek had built. But they could be shattered, broken into fragments, each enormous ancient intelligence split into thousands of smaller shards, each carrying the personality of the whole, but in a contained and diminished form. These shards were captured and imprisoned inside arcane devices called tesseract labyrinths. One more act of cosmic cruelty, from a different angle. The beings who ate the Necrontyre souls were now prisoners, kept alive but caged, deployed as weapons when needed. The gods became batteries. It was justice of a brutal and imperfect kind, and Zarek felt no satisfaction in it. Because the old ones were gone, and the Eldari were rising, and the Necrons were exhausted, and the price of their immortality was still sitting inside them, an absence that would never be filled. So, the Silent King made his final decision. He ordered every Necron dynasty to stand down, every city to become a tomb, every Necron to climb into a stasis crypt and sleep. They would wait for 60 million years, until the younger races had had their moment, until the galaxy was ready to be claimed. He gave the order, severed the command protocols that allowed him to govern his people, and sailed alone into the void between galaxies, carrying his guilt and his grief into the cold dark between the stars. The vaults sealed, the lights went out. The most powerful civilization the galaxy had ever known went to sleep. Part 3. The Architecture of Eternity. What a crown world actually is. Now that we understand the people and the history that built these places, we can walk into one. But I want you to understand something fundamental before we do. A Necron crown world is not simply a big version of a regular tomb world. Well, it is a different category of thing entirely. Crown worlds occupy the highest tier in the taxonomy of Necron tomb worlds, above the core worlds that form the heart of a dynasty's territory, and far above the fringe worlds that represent distant and less important colonial holdings. The crown world is the seat of the pharaoh, the absolute ruler of an entire dynasty. It is the capital of an empire that once spanned the galaxy. To understand what that means architecturally and practically, you need to understand the hierarchy of tomb world categories. Fringe worlds were the Necron tire's least important colonial holdings, distant, relatively poor, built with inferior materials and less redundancy in their systems. They are accordingly the least reliable after the Great Sleep, the most likely to have experienced catastrophic stasis failures, the most likely to have been colonized by other species in the Necron's absence. But core worlds are substantially better. The middle tier of the dynasty, important worlds built with good materials and solid systems, home to significant military and economic assets. But crown worlds were built with everything the Necron tire had. Every technical advantage, every resource, every refinement that 60 million years of civilizational development could produce. The stasis crypts on a crown world are the most advanced that exist anywhere, built to tolerances that make failure almost impossible across the relevant timescales. The power systems have redundancy upon redundancy. The defensive systems are the most sophisticated. The archives are the most comprehensive. This is why, when a crown world awakens, it tends to awaken well. The inhabitants that emerge from the stasis crypts here are, by the standards of the Great Sleep, relatively intact. Not perfectly intact. There is no such thing as perfectly intact after 60 million years in any stasis system ever built, but intact enough that the ruling dynasty can function with something approaching its pre-sleep capacity. From orbit, a crown world looks, at first glance, like a dead world. That is intentional. The Necron tire were hiding from the Aeldari when they built these places, and they designed the surface to offer nothing worth investigating. What the typical crown world surface presents as barren rock and desert, lifeless, uninviting, the kind of world that a passing Aeldari ship would register and move on from without pausing. The atmosphere is usually thin, the chemistry hostile to biology, the temperature extreme. Nothing grows on the surface. Nothing moves. The wind might carry mineral dust across the open plains, and that is the most dynamic thing that happens up there for millions of years at a stretch. But the surface is, yet in the great context of what this world truly is, completely irrelevant. The real crown world is underground. Imagine descending through the planet's crust via one of the access shafts. And there are very few of these, hidden with extraordinary care, trap-laden, almost impossible to locate without the encoded knowledge that only a Necron would carry in their memory banks. As you descend through the outer geological layers, the rock around you gives way gradually to something that is no longer purely natural. You begin to see structures worked into the stone itself, tunnels lined not with rough-cut rock, but with smooth surfaces of necrodermis, the living metal that forms the basis of essentially all Necron technology. It is black and subtly iridescent, and it does not reflect light so much as absorb it and re-emit it in slightly different frequencies, giving everything a quality of dim alien illumination that seems to come from the walls themselves rather than from any specific source. The corridors widen as you go deeper, and then they open into something that restructures your understanding of the word interior. The great halls of a Necron crown world are spaces so vast that the concepts of interior and exterior begin to lose their meaning. These are not rooms in any ordinary architectural sense, and they are voids carved from the bedrock of a planet, stretching for kilometers in every direction, their ceilings lost in darkness far above where any eye can follow. The columns that support these spaces are not mere structural elements. They are integrated components of the tomb's living systems, carrying power, carrying data, conducting the slow pulses of energy that keep the stasis crypts functioning across geological time. The columns themselves are 20 meters in diameter at their bases, tapering as they rise into the darkness above, carved with geometric patterns that repeat at different scales from floor to lost ceiling. In the green light that bleeds from the walls, they look like the trunks of some impossible petrified forest. The aesthetic of a crown world's interior is one of severe and alien grandeur. The Necron tier aesthetic was shaped by their obsession with death, permanence, and mathematical precision. Their art tends toward hard geometric forms, and towards symbols that echo and repeat at different scales, towards surfaces that suggest an absolute commitment to exactness rather than organic flow. The decoration that exists in these halls, and there is significant decoration, because these were once the homes of a proud and powerful civilization that cared deeply about demonstrating that power, takes the form of vast friezes worked directly into the living metal walls. It narratives in relief that depict the great events of Necrontyre and Necron history, the war in heaven, the dynastic glory days, the victories against the old ones, the march of legions across conquered worlds, the shattering of the Satan. What you will not find much of, notably, is anything depicting joy, laughter, the warmth of community, and shared pleasure. Thus, the Necrontyre aesthetic does not dwell on the pleasant quotidian moments of biological existence. This is not a culture that decorated its great halls with images of feasting, or music, or the warmth of gathered families. Everything points toward power, toward the inevitability of time, toward the relationship between death and the beings who had refused to be limited by it. It is beautiful, genuinely, profoundly, eerily beautiful. But it is the beauty of a funeral monument that will outlast the sun, not the beauty of a home. The stasis crypts themselves are arranged in ordered arrays of almost incomprehensible scale, row upon row of sealed chambers, tier upon tier, extending into depths and distances that no single observer could take in. Each crypt is a self-contained unit of engineering, roughly sarcophagus-shaped, built to maintain an interior environment of perfect stasis for an indefinite period. The outer casing of a stasis crypt on a crown world is multi-layered, each layer serving a different function in the preservation process. The innermost layer maintains the specific electromagnetic and gravitational field geometry that holds the sleeping Necron's consciousness in suspension. Outer layers provide insulation against environmental fluctuations, structural integrity against geological stresses, and interfaces with the tomb complex's broader power and monitoring networks. Yet inside each one, a Necron sleeps. If you could walk through the crypt arrays of a crown world at full capacity, billions of sealed chambers, the vast majority of them occupied, the experience would be genuinely overwhelming. The scale of it defeats ordinary comprehension. Each crypt holds a consciousness that was once a person. 60 million years of suspended animation, of a mind held at the edge of existence, not truly dreaming but not truly absent, as maintained in that impossible equilibrium by systems that have been running without interruption for longer than humanity has existed as a species, and there are billions of them. At the center of the most important sections of the crown world, in chambers that feel almost ceremonial in their proportions, are the greatest crypts of all. These singular chambers are reserved for the pharaoh and the most senior members of the royal court. A pharaoh's crypt is not the utilitarian sealed box of a warrior's stasis chamber. It is a room unto itself, vaulted and engraved with the full history of the dynasty, carved in exquisite detail, lit by the steady green glow of the power systems that serve it, surrounded by the lesser crypts of the Lich Guard, who are the ruler's personal bodyguard, and who sleep at their master's side. At the center of this room, on a raised dais of black stone, the extraordinary warp-dampening material known as noctilith, sits the sarcophagus of the pharaoh. It is the throne of a dynasty and the bed of an empire simultaneously, and it hums, quietly, with the power of systems that have been keeping its occupant alive across time frames that make the concept of historical memory almost meaningless. And Part 4, the eternal custodians, the deep spirit, and the canoptek swarms. For 60 million years, a span of time so immense that stars have been born, lived full lives, and died during the interval. The crown world has not been in stasis. The crown world has been working. Quietly, continuously, without pause or rest, or any of the disruptions that afflict organic maintenance systems over long periods. The lights are on, after a fashion. The systems are running. As the stasis crypts are being monitored, serviced, adjusted when parameters drift outside acceptable ranges. The perimeter is being patrolled. The power systems are being tended. The data archives are being preserved against the gradual entropic decay that affects all physical storage over sufficient timescales. None of this happens automatically, in the sense of requiring no mechanism. All of it is the result of systems so complex, so carefully designed, and so thoughtfully planned that the Necron tire engineers who built them are, objectively, among the greatest technological minds in the history of the galaxy, and the systems that make it possible operate in two interlocking layers, the computational and the physical. The computational layer is called the deep spirit, and it is the closest thing the Necrons have to what you might call a fully autonomous artificial intelligence. The deep spirit is the master control program of the tomb world, not a single centralized processor that could be shut down by destroying a specific location, but a distributed intelligence that runs across processing nodes embedded throughout the living metal of the tomb complex, the walls and floors and ceilings themselves serving as components of its processing substrate. The collective computational power of this distributed system is difficult to exaggerate. Yes, it dwarfs anything the Adeptus Mechanicus has managed to construct in 10,000 years of effort. The deep spirit's job, across 60 million years, is essentially to be the mind of the crown world, in the absence of any Necron consciousness active enough to serve that function. It monitors the status of every stasis crypt in the complex, checking their vital parameters on cycles too rapid for any organic mind to track, noting and responding to any deviation from baseline before that deviation can become a problem. It processes environmental data from the surface and from space, watching for threats, cataloging changes in the surrounding star system, tracking the movements of ships in nearby space as civilizations rise and fall and rise again in the ages of the Great Sleep. It maintains the operational integrity of systems built 60 million years ago. It's running maintenance cycles and coordinating self-repair routines that keep the tomb functional through processes of slow, continuous attention that never pause and never rest. The deep spirit can also make decisions within certain parameters, not in the creative, intuitive way of a genuinely conscious being. It is not capable of the kind of improvisation that Necron nobility can manage, but in a precisely calibrated, hierarchical way that covers an enormous range of possible situations. The Necron tier engineers anticipated the need for their creation to handle a very wide variety of contingencies without direct oversight, and they built decision trees of extraordinary depth and complexity into its operating framework. The deep spirit can respond to threats at multiple levels of escalation. It can redirect power from non-critical systems to critical ones when demands spike, and it can make judgments about when the sleeping Necrons need to be disturbed and when a situation can be managed by the automated systems alone. It can even, in certain circumstances, initiate partial reactivation sequences for specific sections of the military forces, waking targeted Necron units to respond to threats that the canoptek constructs alone cannot handle. Because alongside the deep spirit, maintaining and defending the physical reality of the crown world are the canoptek constructs. Yet the canoptek constructs are not Necrons. This is a point worth emphasizing. They were never the Necron tier. They did not go through biotransference. They have no consciousness, no personality.
Okay, I want to take a quick second and just be honest with you why I actually wanted to cover this topic. Because out of everything in 40k, and there's a lot of everything in 40k, the Necrons are the faction that I find myself thinking about the most when I step away from the hobby. Not during a game, not while I'm painting, but just like randomly. Driving somewhere, lying awake at 3 in the morning for no reason. And it's specifically this idea of the crown world, this image of something impossibly ancient just sitting there in the dark, perfectly preserved, waiting. There's something about that I can't shake because it's not presented as a good thing. The whole point of that, the Necrons got exactly what they wanted, and it cost them everything that made wanting things meaningful in the first place. I think that's genuinely one of the most interesting ideas in any science fiction setting I've encountered, and I wanted to give it the time it deserves. So I hope you're enjoying this one.
No remnant of organic experience from before their creation. They were built from the very beginning as machines, complex, capable, adaptable machines, but machines nonetheless. They are entirely distinct from the Necrons they serve, which is partly why they are trusted with such profound responsibility. A canoptech construct will not fall to the psychological afflictions that stalk Necron minds after centuries of sustained stress. It will not develop the destructive obsessions that sometimes corrupt a noble's personality over sufficient time. It will not, crucially, wake up one day and decide that it has its own agenda worth pursuing at the expense of its function. It will simply do what it was made to do indefinitely for as long as the physical components permit. And in a tomb complex built with Crown World level quality, those components will endure for a very long time. The most iconic of the canoptech constructs are the scarabs, small beetle-like constructs, roughly the size of a hand, built from the same living metal necrodermis that forms the basis of all Necron technology. Individually, a scarab is not impressive, but scarabs are never truly individual. They operate in swarms, connected to each other through distributed processing that gives the swarm a collective intelligence greater than any individual unit possesses. And a large scarab swarm is one of the most remarkable natural phenomena, if the word natural can be applied, in the 40k setting. Scarabs are universal material processors. They can consume almost anything: organic matter, metals, stone, composites, essentially any substance that exists in the physical universe, and break it down into its component energies. These energies can then be stored, redirected, or used to fabricate new materials through processes that look, from the outside, like a kind of metallic alchemy. The implications of this for 60 million years of maintenance are enormous. Over geological timeframes, everything degrades. Metal fatigues. Power systems develop inefficiencies through quantum-level changes that accumulate over sufficient time. Conduits crack. Surfaces corrode through processes too slow for a human lifespan to observe, but very real across the relevant scales. The scarabs address all of this ceaselessly, endlessly, in swarms that move through every corridor and chamber of the Crown World like slow rivers of metallic insects, consuming deteriorated material and replacing it with fresh fabricated necrodermis extruded from their bodies. They are the tomb's immune system. Where damage appears, they converge. Where resources are needed, they gather and process and provide. Because they are self-replicating, a canoptech spider can produce new scarabs as needed, converting available energy into new units. The swarm never truly diminishes below critical mass. Even a catastrophic event that destroys thousands of scarabs in a section of the tomb will result in new units being fabricated to replace them before the unmonitored section can deteriorate beyond recoverable parameters. The canoptech spiders are larger, more complex constructs. Spider-like entities, roughly the size of a small vehicle, hovering on anti-gravitic systems, moving through the tomb's halls with a deliberate and patient grace. Where the scarabs handle micro-scale maintenance, the spiders coordinate and command, directing the swarms, managing more complex repair tasks that require careful oversight rather than simple material processing, serving as the local processing nodes through which the deep spirit's will is expressed in the physical world. A triad of spiders operating in concert creates a gestalt intelligence. 3 simple minds combining into something considerably more capable, and a kind of emergent processing that allows for sophisticated real-time decision-making at the local level, rather than requiring every minor judgment to be routed back through the deep spirit's central processing. The Canoptech wraiths are the sentinels and patrol units of the tomb, the things that move in the dark and find whatever enters uninvited. They are sleek and sinuous constructs built for speed and violence rather than maintenance, and capable of phasing in and out of physical reality through phase field projectors. A wraith moving through a tomb complex does not need to navigate corridors. It passes directly through walls, moving through the stone and metal of the structure as though through empty air, appearing and disappearing at will. Their sensory systems are tuned to detect the electromagnetic signatures of any organism with a functioning biological metabolism anywhere within the ranges they patrol. And a wraith that detects an intruder does not raise an alarm. It simply moves to intercept. And if a wraith is not immediately available, or if the threat is too large for a wraith to handle alone, there are the tomb stalkers, vast centipede-like constructs that phase through solid rock with the casual ease of a fish through water, patrolling the geological strata themselves, the kilometers of stone above and below the tomb complex. They are the dungeon's deepest guard, the things that wait in the impossible dark between levels, that can emerge from the solid floor in front of an intruder who thought they were safely between levels of the complex. All of these constructs absorb ambient energy from the environment around them. They do not stop. And so the crown world breathes in its strange mechanical way through the eons. The scarabs move in their endless rivers through corridors that no Necron eye has witnessed in 60 million years. What the wraiths phase through chambers where the stasis crypts hum with frequencies too deep for organic ears. The spiders drift on their anti-gravitic systems, coordinating the maintenance cycles, managing the repair schedules, running their diagnostic subroutines over and over in the patient mechanical repetition of beings that have no concept of boredom because they have no concept of experience. The world waits, perfectly preserved, for when it will be needed. Up to Part 5. The Hierarchy. Life among the Undying. When a crown world begins to awaken, the process is not sudden. It is a ceremony as much as a mechanical sequence, a slow, carefully staged ritual of reactivation, planned in minute detail by the Necron engineers who designed the tomb and executed by the Deep Spirit with the precision of a system that has been rehearsing the procedure for 60 million years. The lower tiers wake first, not because they are less important in any deep sense, but because the logical sequence of awakening requires each tier to prepare the conditions for the next. Secondary power grids come online. Environmental control in zones that will need to be habitable activates. Then the first warriors emerge from their crypts in a state that is not quite consciousness as any organic being would understand it. Aware, able to process their environment, capable of following protocols and responding to commands, but operating on deeply buried programs rather than anything we would recognize as thoughtful engagement with their situation. They fan out through the recently awakened sections of the complex, beginning preliminary sweeps, cataloging the state of the tomb, flagging discrepancies. They are also checking for threats. If something has managed to breach the complex in the aeons since the Great Sleep began, the first wave of revived warriors will encounter it. As each tier of the hierarchy awakens, the complexity of the personalities involved increases. The immortals, the slightly more elite infantry, have somewhat more distinct cognitive architectures than the basic warriors, personalities that are a bit more capable of independent assessment in the field. But they are still essentially soldiers, and soldiers whose inner lives are not particularly rich. It is when the nobility begins to emerge that things get genuinely interesting. The lords are the lower tier of Necron nobility. A Necron lord has retained enough personality and cognitive complexity to have genuine character, memories spanning their biological lives as Necron tier, their service as Necrons before the Great Sleep, and whatever residue survives from the sleep itself. They have opinions, they have preferences, they have relationships, or the Necron equivalent of them, which is complicated but real. They have, in many cases, had been nursing particular grievances and ambitions since before the Great Sleep, and they are extremely ready to act on them. Above the lords are the overlords, the rulers of individual tomb worlds and clusters of worlds. An overlord's mind is a calculating engine of extraordinary sophistication, capable of processing the variables of a complex military and political situation simultaneously in ways that no organic general could match. And they are also deeply complicated individuals whose personalities have been shaped by experiences that no other living being in the current galaxy has any frame of reference for. Because Necron nobility remembers. Not everything. Biotransference and the long sleep have eroded and blurred many things. But they remember an astonishing amount. They remember what it was to be flesh. They remember the war in heaven. They remember comrades who are now dust, or who woke as something unrecognizable, or who still sleep in damaged crypts that may never successfully complete reactivation. They remember victories that have not been celebrated in 60 million years and defeats that have not been avenged in the same span of time. This is the psychological reality that shapes Necron noble culture, and it is genuinely alien to anything that shorter-lived species produce. Human politics operates on the compressed timescales of decades. The grudges are recent, the alliances are fresh, yet the ambitions are formed in living memory. Even the most ancient feuds that human aristocracies nurse might span a few centuries at most. Necron noble politics operates on timescales that make this look like a child's argument over a toy. A Necron overlord awakening on a crown world might be carrying animosities that predate the existence of human civilization by 45 million years. Or they might hold in their memory, with absolute clarity, a wrong done to their dynasty by a rival house before humanity's ancestors had learned to use stone tools. And that wrong feels entirely recent to the overlord, because for 60 million years they were sleeping, not living. The time that passed felt like nothing. The grudge is still fresh. The royal court that forms around an overlord is one of the great political institutions of the 40k setting, though it rarely receives the in-depth attention it deserves. An overlord's court consists of the lords who owe fealty, the cryptecs who serve in an advisory and technical capacity, the Lich Guard who serve as personal bodyguards, and various other specialist Necrons whose abilities make them valuable. The dynamics within this court are sophisticated and richly consequential. There are always plots. Among beings this intelligent, this experienced, and this long-lived, there are always plots. A Necron noble society is, in a very particular way, built for intrigue. The personalities involved are sharp, deeply experienced in the mechanics of power, and operating within a system where the formal hierarchy is clear, but where the routes to greater influence are numerous and not always above board. A lord who wants more resources, who wants to expand their sphere of influence, who wants to cultivate an alliance with a powerful cryptech or unseat a rival from a position of strategic importance, has to operate within the constraints of formal hierarchy while also pursuing whatever more subtle methods their ancient minds produce. The Overlord sits above all of this as both ultimate authority and ultimate target. A skilled Overlord manages their court with the awareness that every individual in it is simultaneously a potential rival, a potential asset, and a potential danger. The most capable Overlords are extraordinary political operators, manipulating court dynamics in ways that serve their larger strategic aims, while keeping the various factions balanced against each other in precisely the configurations most beneficial to the ruler's own position. And they have had 60 million years of their pre-sleep experience to develop that capability. There is one more element of the Crown World social structure worth dwelling on, and it is among the most uniquely Necron aspects of the whole situation. The question of entertainment, of culture, of how an immortal being with limited emotional capacity and no organic needs fills its time between military campaigns and political maneuvering. The answer is complicated and in some ways genuinely surprising. Necron nobles do engage in what might loosely be called cultural activities. But there is an interest in history among the nobility that goes far beyond practical military or political value, an almost scholarly engagement with the past that serves the function. For beings who remember so much of it personally, that academic study serves for humans. Debating the interpretation of events that both participants actually witnessed 60 million years ago is a pursuit that can sustain Necron court conversation for what would, by human standards, be extraordinary spans of time. There is also an interest in what might be called collection, the acquisition of objects, knowledge, and in some cases individuals of historical or strategic significance. The legendary Trazyn the Infinite, the overlord of the Solemnace Crown world, takes this tendency to its most extreme expression, having constructed an enormous gallery of preserved specimens from throughout the galaxy's history, including living beings captured at the moment of their most significant actions and preserved in stasis for Trazyn's personal archives. The other Necron dynasties regard Trazyn with a mixture of exasperation and grudging admiration. His methods are eccentric by any standard. His collection is, by any honest assessment, the most comprehensive archive of galactic history that exists anywhere. There is art of a kind. Necron noble culture produces objects of aesthetic significance, though the aesthetic is not one that most organic beings would recognize as beautiful. The mathematical precision of Necron tire design philosophy carries over into the objects that Necron nobles commission from their artisan classes. Geometry, proportion, the relationship between form and function expressed at the highest level of technical execution. It is not warm, it is not welcoming, it is not human, but it is not nothing either. And there are the games. As extended strategic exercises, simulations of military campaigns, historical reconstructions, analytical exercises that pit one noble's tactical thinking against another's. Not purely recreational, since the skills involved are directly applicable to the real military challenges the dynasty faces, but not purely utilitarian either. There is something that functions like competitive pleasure in the outcome, when one overlord's strategy defeats another's in a well-conducted exercise. It is worth noting that in all of this, the beings doing it are ancient and brilliant and terribly diminished compared to what they once were. The warmth is gone, the spontaneity is gone, but the capacity for the kind of joy or grief or passion that can surprise a person with its sudden intensity is reduced to something more like a cold analog, a recognition of satisfaction or frustration or strategic interest that processes through mechanical pathways rather than the organic emotional systems it replaced. They know, in some technical sense, that they are diminished. The most self-aware of them feel this as an absence that sits quietly at the center of everything they do. Yes, unacknowledged in formal settings because acknowledgement would be a kind of weakness, but present nonetheless. Part 6. The Cryptex. Wielders of science beyond mortal reach. If the overlords and lords are the political and military heart of a crown world, the Cryptex are its intellectual and technological soul, and they occupy a position of genuine power that is entirely separate from, and sometimes in direct tension with, the formal hierarchy. Cryptex were, in the era before biotransference, the priestly class of Necron-tire civilization. They served as court advisors and spiritual guides. They studied the stars, divined the future through astrology of a sophisticated kind, oversaw funeral rituals, and attempted to treat the radiation sicknesses that plagued every level of society. Over time, as the Necron-tire developed their remarkable technology and the priest-scholars evolved with it, yet the Cryptex became something different, practitioners of what other species would call arcane science, but what the Cryptex themselves understand as simply the deepest and most advanced manipulation of physical reality available to any material being in the universe. By the time of the Great Sleep, the Cryptex had developed specializations that seem, from the outside, almost indistinguishable from different schools of magic. Chronomancers manipulate time itself, not metaphorically, but in actual, measurable ways that can accelerate, slow, or in limited cases, reverse the flow of time in localized areas. They wear tiles forged from crystallized moments on their essence tomes, adding new tiles as their mastery deepens. Plasmancers work with plasma and electromagnetic energy at a fundamental level, capable of creating sustained fields of controlled stellar plasma that they direct as weapon systems. Voidmancers study the properties of singularities, black holes, and the exotic physics of collapsed stellar matter, and have found ways to weaponize the impossible physics of these objects. Ethermancers work with the boundary between material reality and the fundamental forces that underlie it, manipulating energies that have no common names because they were only identified by beings sufficiently advanced to see them. None of this is warp-based. This is critical to understand. Thus, the Necrons lost their connection to the warp when they lost their souls in biotransference. They cannot use psychic powers, cannot channel the Imperium, and cannot be affected by a vast range of the warp's dangers. What the cryptechs use instead is an understanding of pure physical science, so advanced and so deep that it produces effects identical from the outside to what less advanced species would call miracles. The Citan took the Necron's souls but left them their minds, and those minds have had 60 million years to develop their understanding of the physical universe. The cryptech's relationship to the Necron nobility is a masterwork of subtle power dynamics. Formally, they have no rank within the political hierarchy of a dynasty, but the cryptechs understand something that the overlords could never be truly comfortable with. Tomb worlds require perpetual, expert maintenance of their countless integrated systems, and only cryptechs have the knowledge to provide it. A cryptech who has been slighted by their patron overlord might discover that the tomb's maintenance cycle develops certain unexplained inefficiencies. Systems that used to function smoothly develop persistent minor faults that are always just barely within acceptable parameters, but that collectively add up to a subtle degradation in capability that happens to most affect the overlord's own facilities and equipment. The message, Chaz communicated in the most technically deniable way possible, is clear. The overlord's continued effectiveness depends on the cooperation of the very beings they just offended. Even the proudest, most ancient Necron overlord tends to develop a pragmatic appreciation for cryptech goodwill when faced with the prospect of their soldiers' weapons failing at strategically inconvenient moments. On a crown world specifically, the cryptechs play a role that goes beyond technical expertise, as they are the keepers of the archive. The stored knowledge accumulated by the Necrontyr across their civilization and expanded in the Necron era before the Great Sleep. The archives of a crown world are the most comprehensive records of the pre-Great Sleep galaxy that exist anywhere in the universe. The old ones are gone. The civilizations that existed 60 million years ago have left essentially no trace that any younger race can read. But the Necrons have their archives, and the cryptechs are the ones who maintain them, who can navigate them, who understand what is preserved there. This gives cryptechs on a crown world a particular kind of power that goes beyond technical expertise. They are the ones who know, in the most literal sense, what the Necrontyr actually were, what the ancient galaxy truly looked like, and what the real history of their race consists of, as opposed to the fragmented, distorted, politically edited memories that individual Necrons carry in their damaged engrams. In a society of beings for whom personal memory is both fundamental and deeply unreliable, after 60 million years of imperfect stasis, the keepers of the institutional archive hold authority that no amount of military force can easily negate. A cryptech who maintains a crown world's historical archive possesses knowledge that every Necron noble would, in some sense, pay almost anything to access. Who was on which side of which conflict 60 million years ago? What debts were incurred and never repaid? What alliances were made and subsequently broken? What the great pharaohs of the ancient era were actually like, beyond the heroic narratives that the most powerful families prefer to have circulated about their ancestors. This kind of knowledge, held in this kind of institution, wielded by beings who are themselves ancient, patient, and extraordinarily intelligent. Is a form of power that nothing can easily overcome. Part 7. The Afflicted. Madness in the halls of immortality. There is a darkness in every crown world that even its greatest champions cannot fully acknowledge. A shadow that falls across the marble certainty of Necron superiority and refuses to be banished by any amount of political will or engineering excellence. The Great Sleep was not perfect. It could not have been. As to design a system capable of preserving billions of individual minds across 60 million years of geological time, with zero degradation and zero loss of integrity, would require a level of perfection that exceeds even the extraordinary capabilities of Necron-tier engineering at the height of their power. Stasis crypt failures happen. Power interruptions, however brief, however minor, can disrupt the delicate field geometries that maintain consciousness in suspension. Microfractures in the necrodermis architecture of the crypts can allow quantum-level decoherence to accumulate over sufficient timescales, and 60 million years provides more than sufficient timescales for subtle damage to become significant. When a stasis crypt fails badly enough, the Necron inside does not wake. But when it fails in subtler ways, when the degradation is slow, gradual, and cumulative rather than sudden, the Necron inside can eventually emerge from the sleep with their body intact but their mind in a condition that ranges from mildly altered to catastrophically broken. And on a crown world, where the stasis systems are the finest available, this is a rarer problem than elsewhere, but not an absent one. The Destroyer cult is perhaps the most widespread and most dangerous affliction in Necron society. It's present on every tomb world that Imperial scholars have studied. Destroyers are Necrons, sometimes warriors, sometimes immortals, sometimes nobles of genuine rank, who have awakened with something fundamentally broken in their relationship to existence itself. Where a normal Necron, however diminished by biotransference and the long sleep, retains at minimum a commitment to their dynasty's purposes, a Destroyer has lost even that. What fills the void is a burning, a total conviction that all organic life must be destroyed, not conquered, not subjugated, not incorporated into the dynasty's rising empire. Destroyed, eliminated, removed from the universe so completely that nothing remains to indicate it ever existed. Destroyers want to kill everything that lives, because everything that lives is a reminder of what they no longer are. And that reminder has become unbearable in a way that has overwhelmed every other processing function. There is a particular horror in understanding the Destroyer cult that emerges when you think carefully about what biotransference did to the Necron tier. Every single Necron is, at some level, a being who used to be organic, who remembers, however dimly, what it was like to have a body that breathed and felt pain and the warmth of sunlight on skin, who traded all of that away and received immortality in exchange, and who must live forever with the awareness of what was given up. Most Necrons manage this existential situation. They function, they pursue their dynastic purposes, they find in power and victory something that serves as a substitute for meaning. Destroyers cannot manage it. Something in the long sleep broke the mechanism by which they maintained that functional relationship with their soulless existence, and what remains is only rage. Pure, consuming, operationally total rage against biological existence on a crown world. Yet the Destroyer cult exists on the margins, literally, occupying the outermost and most isolated sections of the tomb complex, tolerated by the ruling nobility, because Destroyers in battle are extraordinarily effective killing machines, but kept at careful distance because a Destroyer cult that runs out of organic targets will turn to whatever targets are available. They are weapons that can be aimed, but not truly controlled, and the Overlord who deploys them must always be thinking about the aftermath. The flayed ones represent a different and in some ways even more disturbing affliction, because theirs has a specific origin. In the closing days of the war in heaven, when the Necrons turned on the Citan, most star gods were shattered into fragments. But one, Landugor the Flayer, was not shattered. It was destroyed completely, annihilated beyond any possibility of recovery. In its final moments, and it inflicted a curse on the Necrons who killed it. A curse designed to activate not immediately, but gradually over time, as the slow degradation of long stasis eroded the psychological buffers that a functional Necron maintains between their metal reality and the deep, atavistic memories of biological existence that their converted minds still carry. When the Flayer curse activates, the result is one of the most disturbing phenomena in the 40k setting. The afflicted Necron develops a hunger, irrational, overwhelming, and completely unsatisfiable, for organic material. They kill, not for tactical reasons, but to have flesh, to drape it over their metal frames, to dress themselves in the skins of their victims, and walk as something that, at an angle, in a certain light, might almost look like it once had a biological life. The flayed one, wearing its horrific trophies, is simultaneously monstrous and, if you look at it from a particular angle, how deeply sad. It is a machine that remembers being alive and cannot be alive again, and what it does when it gathers its terrible collection is something like grieving. A broken, monstrous, utterly unconscious form of grief. The ghost of a desire for something that was taken away 60 million years ago. On a crown world, flayed ones exist in pocket dimensions that connect to the tomb complex at unpredictable intervals, emerging without warning. Thus they are feared even by the most powerful Necron nobles, because there is something in the flayed one's condition that resonates with fears every Necron carries. The fear that their own grip on identity, on purpose, on sanity, is fragile. That given sufficient time and sufficient damage, any of them could end up this way. There is also the category called the severed, Necrons who woke from the great sleep with their bodies intact, but their minds essentially emptied. Not insane, and not malevolent in any purposeful sense, simply hollow. They respond to stimuli in limited reflexive ways, follow basic protocols, move through halls they no longer recognize, executing programs whose purpose they cannot remember. They are what biotransference always risked producing at scale, machines that function but do not truly live in any meaningful sense. The fate the nobility managed to avoid by virtue of the quality of the bodies they were given, but the fate the lesser Necrons came uncomfortably close to even under ideal conditions. The overlord who commands a crown world navigates all of this. The destroyers on the fringe, the flayed ones in their pocket dimensions, the severed wandering halls they can no longer contextualize, while simultaneously running a functional military and political organization. That they managed to do all of this is a testament to exactly how capable these ancient minds are. But it is also a reminder that what they are managing is not a triumphant return to power. It is a damaged civilization pulling itself back together from the consequences of a decision made 60 million years ago, doing the best it can with what the Great Sleep left behind. Part 8. 60 million years. The weight of deep time. Let us pause and actually try to feel what 60 million years means. Us, because I think it is genuinely difficult to hold this number in your mind in a way that is meaningful rather than simply abstract. 60 million years ago, from the perspective of the real universe we inhabit, there were no humans. There were no primates worth speaking of. The great extinction event that ended the non-avian dinosaurs on Earth had occurred about 5 million years before that point. So 60 million years ago, the planet was in the very early stages of recovery from that catastrophe. Warm and strange, and populated by forms of life that would not be recognizable as ancestors of anything modern. Grasses had not evolved yet. The Alps and the Himalayas had not formed yet. The Atlantic Ocean was considerably narrower than it is today. The continents were in different positions. And when the Necron were building their crown worlds and loading their warriors into stasis crypts and sealing the vaults, the geological processes that would create essentially all of the landscapes that human history was eventually played out against were still unfinished. The mountain ranges were not there. The continent shapes were different. Almost nothing recognizable existed. And from that moment until the present of the 41st millennium, the Necrons slept. In that interval, the Eldari Empire rose and consumed the galaxy in its fashion. Brilliant, extraordinary, and ultimately self-destructive, it fell in the psychic catastrophe of the fall, and the echo of that collapse still reverberates through the warp. The orcs warred across countless worlds. Humanity evolved from primate ancestors, developed consciousness, built its first civilizations, learned to use fire, developed agriculture, built cities and religions and empires, developed space travel, expanded across the stars during the dark age of technology, collapsed in the age of strife, was reunified by the emperor of mankind, built an imperium of millions of worlds, suffered the devastating civil war of the Horus heresy, and spent 10,000 years in the grinding eternal warfare that defines the setting of the 41st millennium. All of that happened while the Necrons slept, and now they are waking up. Right, and from their perspective, from the perspective of a Necron overlord stepping out of their sarcophagus on a newly awakening crown world, not much time has passed at all. The sleep felt like nothing. The sleep felt like blinking. Yesterday, in any meaningful phenomenological sense, was the end of the war in heaven. Yesterday was the moment the Satan was shattered and the vaults were sealed. This is genuinely one of the most alien aspects of Necron psychology, the temporal discontinuity at the heart of their experience. The Overlord awakening on the Crown World carries in their memory a galaxy that no longer exists in any recognizable form, alongside the full emotional weight of experiences they feel were recent, and must navigate a present that looks nothing like what they remember. It is a form of dislocation that has no real parallel in any organic experience. Not sleep, as not coma, not even the warp's strange relationship with time, produces anything quite like this combination of perfect continuity of self with complete discontinuity of context. The court of a newly awakening crown world deals with this through several mechanisms. Extensive diagnostic work is conducted in the early period. Each Necron noble who has emerged from stasis is assessed for cognitive integrity, their memory banks checked against the archived baseline, their personality engrams compared to their pre-sleep profiles. This is delicate work because the kinds of changes that 60 million years of imperfect stasis can produce are subtle. A lord who seems perfectly functional might turn out, on close examination, to have developed a persistent fixation that did not exist before, or to have lost access to a portion of their memories that they cannot themselves identify as missing. These assessments are conducted privately, yet the results guarded carefully, because the political landscape of a newly awakening crown world is itself a competition, and any evidence of weakness, any suggestion that a particular lord or overlord has come through the sleep in less than perfect condition is immediately useful to rivals. There is also the work of intelligence gathering. The crown world's deep spirit has been collecting data for 60 million years, monitoring the electromagnetic spectrum, cataloguing passing ships, and noting the broad signatures of civilizational activity in surrounding space. And all of this data forms the starting point for understanding the current state of the galaxy. But it is crude data, and it needs to be interpreted by Necron minds that actually understand what they are looking at. And then there is the question of who is still there. Not every crypt will have successfully preserved its occupant. But not every Necron who was sealed into a stasis chamber 60 million years ago will emerge successfully. The politics of succession, of determining who has the authority to take the positions that were held by nobles who did not survive the sleep, are among the most fraught negotiations in the early days of any crown world's awakening. Ancient arrangements must be honored or overturned or renegotiated. And alliances that were formed before the Great Sleep may find that one or both parties have been lost or changed beyond recognition, or have developed new priorities that change the calculus of the relationship. The crown world that emerges from the Great Sleep is not simply the crown world that went into it. It is something new, the same in form and in the broad outlines of its identity, but subtly, and in some cases, profoundly different in the specific configuration of minds and relationships and power dynamics that actually constitute its daily reality. Part 9. The New Empire Rising, Awakening, and What Comes After. The fully awakened Crown World is one of the most formidable things in the Warhammer 40,000 setting. By the time the awakening process reaches its completion, the Pharaon commanding, the lords and overlords of the royal court at their stations, the warrior legions marching through the great halls in their deployment formations, the cryptechs at work in their laboratories and archives, the canoptech swarms that maintained the world through the ages, now transitioning to active support roles. The Crown World has transformed from a sleeping sepulchre into the beating heart of a rising empire. The scale of this transformation is difficult to exaggerate. The sheer military capability concentrated in a single fully awakened Crown World, with its billions of Necron warriors and its arsenal of technologies that the Adeptus Mechanicus cannot fully replicate, represents a threat that the Imperium's strategists do not have adequate frameworks to measure. The Necron warrior, the most basic unit of the dynasty's fighting force, carries a Gauss weapon, a device that strips matter at the atomic level, disassembling the atomic bonds of whatever it targets in a way that can penetrate essentially any armor if given sufficient time. That the most basic Necron soldier carries such a weapon tells you a great deal about the overall technological level of the force. More senior units carry weapons and systems of increasing sophistication. Immortals with heavier Gauss weaponry, Lichguard with war scythes that cut through energy shields and reinforced armor with equal indifference, Triarch Praetorians with void blades and particle casters. And then there is the heavy equipment, the monoliths, vast, floating, essentially indestructible mobile fortresses of living metal, equipped with arrays of particle weapons and equipped with an eternity gate that serves as a dimensional corridor connecting the monolith to the tomb complex and the dynasty's broader network, allowing Necron warriors to be drawn from anywhere in that network and deployed directly through the portal. A single monolith is a weapons platform of staggering power. A Crown World that deploys its full complement simultaneously is expressing a level of military capability that almost nothing in the 41st millennium can meet on equal terms. Beyond the military dimension, the awakened Crown World is the political capital of a dynasty, and the business of building an empire must begin immediately. The Pharaon has to rapidly develop a working understanding of who their friends and enemies are in this transformed galaxy. As ancient rivals from before the Great Sleep have also been awakening, relationships that are automatically complicated because the grudges are real and the history's long. Ancient alliances may be available to be rebuilt, though they require careful renegotiation. The political landscape of the current galaxy must be understood in terms that the pre-sleep archives cannot provide, because the galaxy has fundamentally changed. While the Zarakan dynasty's special position in the current era deserves mention here. As the dynasty that once housed the Silent King himself, the Zarakan have always held a particular prestige in Necron politics. They are the direct descendants of the royal house that made all the great decisions, good and terrible, that shaped the Necron race. With the return of Sarek from his 60 million year exile in the intergalactic void, this prestige has been dramatically amplified. Yet the Silent King has come back to find a galaxy in crisis. Not just the ongoing warfare between factions, but the deeper crisis of the Tyranids, whose consumption of biomass threatens the fundamental basis on which Sarek hopes to restore what was lost. If the Tyranids consume the galaxy's biological resources, the possibility of reversing biotransference, of somehow returning souls to the soulless, organic life to the mechanical, becomes permanently foreclosed. For a Crown World that has recently awakened, how to relate to Sarek's project of dynastic unification is one of the first and most consequential political decisions the ruling Pharaon must make. The great dynasties have taken different positions. The Nihilach, centered on their Crown World of Geddon under Pharaon Crispech, have historically been deeply isolationist, proud, protective of their accumulated wealth and territory, on the kind of neighbors that nobody wants to provoke because the response will be wildly disproportionate. The Sautek, whose Crown World at Mandragora is the seat of Imhotep the Stormlord, have taken the opposite orientation. Aggressive expansion, rapid military engagement, the accumulation of territory and subject worlds. The Nihilak recently ended their isolation and have begun a campaign of expansion, hunting chaos forces and establishing vast sectors of space under their dominion. In each crown world that awakens represents an enormous node of ancient power, reconnecting to the larger fabric of what is slowly becoming a re-emergent galactic empire. The sheer weight of history that each of these worlds carries, the archives, the noble minds with their 60 million years of accumulated experience, the military assets, the cryptech knowledge, makes each awakening a significant event, not just militarily but cosmically. And each crown world that comes back online shifts the balance of the galaxy a little further toward what the Necrons have always believed was its proper configuration. A universe ordered and governed by the most powerful and most ancient civilization that has ever existed. Part 9, B. The Weapons of Eternity. What a crown world actually feels in battle. There is a particular quality of dread that Astra Militarum officers who have faced Necron forces in the field describe in their after-action reports. Those who survive to write them. It is not the dread of facing something overwhelming in the conventional sense. The Imperium has experience with overwhelming forces. The Tyranids overwhelm with sheer biological mass. The Orcs overwhelm with reckless, inexhaustible aggression. What the Necrons do is different. The dread of facing a Necron force is the dread of watching something you have already destroyed walk back toward you, unhurt, unchanged, completely indifferent to the violence you just inflicted on it. The Necron warrior, the rank-and-file infantry unit that forms the backbone of any Crown World's fighting force, is, by the technical specifications that the Adeptus Mechanicus has managed to assemble from recovered debris, a construction of necrodermis alloy so advanced that replicating it is genuinely beyond the current capacity of Imperial manufacturing. The metal is not passive in the way that ordinary structural alloys are passive. It has, at the molecular level, an active repair function, a property of the material itself, not an external system bolted onto a simpler chassis. When a Necron warrior is hit by weapons fire that would have killed an organic soldier or crippled a conventional machine, whilst the necrodermis begins to re-knit itself around the damage. A warrior that has had its torso blown open by Lascanan fire, that has fallen to the ground in what looks for all the world like death, will, given enough time and a functioning power source, simply close the gap. Stand back up. Continue walking forward. This is the phase-shifting protocol, what most forces fighting the Necrons call reanimation as a shorthand. And it has broken countless Imperial offensives that seemed, by any conventional measure, to be going well. A squad of guardsmen that has put down 20 Necron warriors in a firefight watches those warriors begin to rise again, and the psychological damage of that experience is something that standard Imperial training does not adequately prepare them for. You are not supposed to have to kill the enemy twice. The calculus of attrition warfare assumes that casualties are permanent, that the force you reduce by 20% stays reduced. When the 20% gets back up and resumes firing, the calculus fails completely. The Gauss weaponry that Necron warriors carry extends this technological advantage into the offensive dimension. A Gauss flare, the standard issue weapon of the basic Necron warrior, works by generating an electromagnetic field that disrupts the binding forces holding atoms together in their molecular configurations. The effect is that whatever the beam touches begins to molecularly disassemble. The process looks from a distance like the target is simply coming apart at the seams, flesh unraveling in spiraling wisps of green-lit energy, armor dissolving from the surface, down in layers that curl away like burning paper. It does not matter what the armor is made of. The Gauss field does not punch through armor the way a conventional projectile does, transferring kinetic energy through mass. It removes the armor by attacking the atomic bonds that hold it together. Given a sustained enough beam, it will eventually unravel anything, up to and including the hull plating of a main battle tank. And by the time the beam has worked through the tank's armor, whatever was inside has already been subjected to partial disassembly. This is the weapon that a crown world deploys in its billions, not as an elite weapon issued to special units, as the baseline, as the thing every standard infantry unit carries. And then there are the specialized systems. While the Immortals carry heavier Gauss weaponry, Gauss blasters firing denser, more focused beams that can punch through heavy armor at extended ranges. They also have more sophisticated tactical programming, meaning they fight with a coordination and adaptability that the basic warriors, for all their physical resilience, lack. Where a warrior phalanx advances with the mechanical precision of a program being executed, a formation of Immortals fights with something closer to genuine tactical intelligence, reading the battlefield, adjusting to defensive positions, exploiting weaknesses in real time. The Lich Guard are the elite close combat units of a Crown World's fighting force, and they represent a category of threat that heavy weapons cannot effectively manage, because by the time you bring heavy weapons to bear on a Lich Guard formation, the Lich Guard are already inside your defensive perimeter. They carry war scythes, weapons that combine a physica-cutting blade of extraordinary hardness with an energy field generated by the necrodermis components of the weapon's construction, a field that disrupts and collapses other energy fields it contacts. Void shields, refractor fields, the conversion shields carried by elite troops. These are the systems that the Imperium relies on to keep its most important assets alive in high-threat environments. But the Lich Guard's war scythes are specifically designed to negate them, to bring the raw metal edge of the blade into contact with flesh and armor directly, without the buffer of whatever protective field might otherwise stand between it and the target. The Triarch Praetorians are the enforcers of the Triarch, the ancient ruling council that governed Necron law in the era before the Great Sleep, whose surviving members now serve as roving agents carrying the authority of Necron law across all dynasties, regardless of political affiliation. They carry void blades and particle casters, weapons that allow them to function as fast, aggressive solo threat units, capable of rapidly breaking down specific high-value targets. Where a Lich Guard formation is a wall of elite violence moving forward collectively, a Praetorian is a scalpel, deployed with precision against the specific element of an enemy formation that most needs to be removed. And then there is the heavy armor. The Doomsday Ark is a Crown World's long-range artillery platform, a vehicle that should not, strictly speaking, be referred to as a vehicle in the sense of something designed to transport forces from one location to another, because its design priorities are entirely organized around the capabilities of the Doomsday cannon it carries. This weapon fires a focused beam of disruption energy at ranges that exceed the targeting capability of most Imperial weapon systems, striking with such concentrated force that the field generated at the point of impact doesn't simply damage, it initiates a cascade disassembly reaction in whatever it strikes. A Doomsday Ark. Round that connects with the armored hull of a Lehman Russ battle tank does not leave a crater. It leaves a rapidly expanding cloud of particles that were once, seconds ago, an armored fighting vehicle, and are now just component matter drifting in the atmosphere. The Night Scythe and the Doom Scythe represent a Crown World's aerial dominance capabilities, and they are, by any objective measure, among the most technologically sophisticated aircraft operating anywhere in the 41st millennium. The Night Scythe is the transport variant, a sleek, crescent-shaped vehicle that looks from a distance like something that probably shouldn't be able to enter atmosphere, given how little of its profile resembles a conventional aerodynamic form, but which moves with effortless grace at velocities that Imperial interceptors struggle to match. It carries a Tesla destructor as its primary weapon system, a lightning-like cascade discharge weapon that chains between nearby targets, meaning that a single sustained discharge can simultaneously damage a cluster of enemy positions without the pilot having to make multiple targeting adjustments. The Doom Scythe is the pure attack variant, stripped of the transport capability, and instead equipped with a death ray, a weapon whose name, for once, is a completely accurate description of what it does. A death ray beam leaves a perfectly cylindrical channel of instantaneous total disassembly along its firing path. Everything inside that cylinder ceases to exist in its previous configuration. But the Crown World's most iconic and most strategically significant weapons platform is the monolith, and no discussion of what these ancient worlds bring to battle is complete without dwelling on it for a moment. The monolith is, by Imperial classification, a super heavy vehicle, but that classification misses something essential about what the monolith actually is. It is not really a vehicle in any conventional sense. It is a dimensional anchor, a massive floating four-faced pyramid of living metal that serves simultaneously as a weapon platform, a mobile defensive fortification, a dimensional gateway, and a tactical command node. The physics of how a monolith floats are not accessible to Imperial science. The necrodermis from which it is constructed generates an anti-gravitic field whose operating principles remain beyond anything the Adeptus Mechanicus has managed to reverse engineer from recovered debris. The field is not powered by any conventional energy source that Imperial instruments can detect. The monolith draws on zero-point energy extraction mechanisms that effectively allow it to run indefinitely without refueling or recharging until destroyed. And destroying a monolith is a project, not a tactical action. The living metal repairs incoming damage in real time in the same way that a Necron warrior's body does, closing hull breaches as they form, rerouting power flows around damaged components, maintaining operational capability under sustained fire that would have destroyed a conventional vehicle in the opening seconds of engagement. Its weapons are a matched quartet of Gauss projectors occupying the corners of its base configuration and a particle whip, a weapon mounted on the crown that generates a controlled burst of exotic particles capable of penetrating essentially any armor variant currently in Imperial service. But its truly decisive tactical feature is the Eternity Gate, a dimensional portal mounted on one face of the pyramid that connects directly to the Crown World's tomb complex, via a quantum tunneling effect. That through this gate, Necron warriors can be pulled directly from the tomb's stasis reserves and deployed onto the battlefield in real time, meaning that a monolith does not just fight, it is a teleportation relay for the entire Crown World's military force. An enemy formation that manages to eliminate the Necron warriors on a battlefield sector occupied by a functioning monolith may find those warriors replaced within moments, drawn fresh from the tomb's inexhaustible reserves. This is the full extent of the Crown World's military reach, the thing that ancient nobles once commanded and are now beginning to command again in the galaxy's most recent era. Not just soldiers who survive being killed, not just weapons that dissolve armor at the atomic level, but a complete, deeply integrated military doctrine built around the fundamental philosophical position that death, as a tactical reality, has been solved. May the Necrons fight the way a civilization fights when it no longer fears casualties in any meaningful sense, not because it does not value its warriors, but because its warriors simply do not stay dead. That attitude, more than any specific weapon system, is what makes a fully awakened Crown World one of the most profoundly dangerous things in the 41st millennium. Part 9c, The Rivals and the Remembered, Other Powers Through Necron Eyes. To understand how a Crown World's ruling nobility actually thinks about the current state of the galaxy, it is worth pausing to consider the question of other powers. How a Pharaon, who has been asleep for 60 million years, processes and evaluates the civilizations they find occupying what was once Necron space, and the wildly varied responses that different dynasties have developed to the same underlying situation. And because the Necrons woke up to find squatters. That is, bluntly, the Necron perspective on the matter. Every world that was once Necron-Tyre territory and has since been colonized by one of the younger races, the Imperium, the Eldari, the Tau, anyone, is, from the Necron point of view, a world occupied by people who moved into a house whose owners were asleep in the basement. The fact that the occupation has lasted for millions of years does not particularly affect this assessment. Why is it? Because from the perspective of an overlord who was in stasis during those millions of years, those years didn't happen in any experiential sense. The Necrontyr controlled that world. Then the Necrontyr slept. Now these short-lived newcomers are on it. What is the appropriate response? The answer varies dramatically by dynasty, and those variations reveal a great deal about how the long sleep changed, and in some cases, failed to change, than the fundamental orientations of the different Necron ruling houses. The Sautek dynasty, centered on the crown world of Mandragora and led in the current era by Imhotep the Stormlord, has the clearest and most direct answer: reclaim everything, by force if necessary, and do it fast. Imhotep is arguably the greatest military mind currently operating in the 41st millennium. A claim that sounds extravagant until you consider that he has millennia of pre-sleep military experience to draw on, and a complete absence of the psychological pressures that affect organic commanders, and an ability to process battlefield variables simultaneously that no human general can match. His campaigns are characterized by a brutally efficient combination of rapid territorial acquisition and careful management of existing populations when their labor or their silence is tactically useful. Imhotep does not kill indiscriminately, not because he values organic life, but because a living population that has been properly cowed is a more useful resource than a dead population that requires the application of additional forces to the logistics of corpse disposal. His rivalry with the Orc warlord Gazgukul Thraka, a conflict that has been running across multiple campaigns on multiple worlds, is one of the more unexpected dynamics in the modern setting. Imhotep despises the Orcs with a particular personal intensity, a finding in their fundamental disregard for any structure or strategy beyond the immediate satisfaction of violence, an affront to every principle he holds. He has defeated Gazgukul's forces multiple times. He has cut off Gazgukul's hand and kept it as a trophy. He once allowed Gazgukul to escape rather than execute him in person, because it pleased Imhotep to think of the Orc warlord living with the knowledge of his defeat. This is not the behavior of a pure machine. This is the behavior of a being who still, despite everything biotransference did to him, has something operating in his personality that functions like contempt and satisfaction and long-term personal animosity. The Nihilach dynasty, by contrast, operated until recently in a fundamentally different mode, one of intense territorial conservatism focused on specific crown worlds and their immediate surrounding sectors, defended with a ferocity completely disproportionate to any rational military calculation. The Nihilach did not try to build a galactic empire, they built a fortress. Their homeworld of Geden was surrounded by layers of warning systems and defensive fortifications that sent a message to the galaxy at large that was unmistakable: do not come here. Do not touch anything here. The consequences of not heeding this warning were demonstrated repeatedly and in considerable detail, as to the civilizations unlucky enough to discover that the warning was not rhetorical. The Nihilach's recent shift toward active expansion, and their particular focus on hunting chaos forces, represents a change significant enough to have drawn attention from other major Necron powers. The ruinous powers, in the Nihilach's estimation, represent not just a military threat, but a philosophical affront. Entities of pure warp energy, whose very existence depends on the presence of souls and the psychic potential of organic consciousness. The Necrons have no souls, no psychic potential, nothing that the chaos gods can use as fuel. This makes them uniquely resistant to chaos corruption in ways that every other major faction cannot match. And the Nihilach have apparently decided that this resistance is itself a strategic asset worth building a military doctrine around. The Nephrek dynasty carries a quality that stands apart from most of its peers, a certain austere grandeur that reflects the ancient tradition of their culture. Where most Necron dynasties carry their military history in decorative battle honors and finely wrought heraldry, the Nephrek's aesthetic is one of burning clarity, polished gold, geometric precision, and the suggestion of radiant heat. They are associated with solar imagery and with a particular relationship to star systems that goes beyond the merely territorial. There is something about how the Nephrek have chosen to present their dynasty's identity that suggests a deeper claim, an association not just with worlds, but with the stars those worlds orbit. They are also among the fastest moving of Necron forces. They're using translocation abilities, the same fundamental quantum teleportation mechanism that allows Necron units to phase between locations, as an integral element of their military doctrine, rather than a specialist capability reserved for specific units. A Nephrek force in battle is not where you saw it a moment ago, and where it will be in the next moment is a function of tactical logic rather than physical movement constraints. Engaging them is, but by the accounts of those who have survived doing so, like fighting fog, except the fog is armed, perfectly resilient, and absolutely certain where it is going. And there are the rogue elements, the wild cards, the exiles and eccentrics, the overlords who operate outside dynasty structures entirely and pursue their own incomprehensible long-term agendas. Trazyn the Infinite is the most celebrated of these, and operating from his crown world of Solemnace, with a freedom that derives partly from his isolation and partly from the fact that he has made himself so diplomatically strange that nobody quite knows how to respond to him. Trazyn has been collecting specimens of galactic history for as long as he has been awake. His collection, preserved in stasis fields throughout Solemnace's vast gallery crypts, includes representatives of species that are now extinct, the individuals taken at the moments of their most historically significant actions, weapons of extraordinary rarity, and objects whose cultural value exceeds anything that could be calculated in conventional military terms. Trazyn has, in recorded instances, lent specimens from his collection to other forces in exchange for access to objects or individuals he wants for his archives. He has shown up at major historical events seemingly by coincidence, which is never coincidence. He intervened at the siege of Cadia using his preserved collection as soldiers, including liberating the Ultramarines Primarch Roboot Guilliman's psychic presence, which he had at some point apparently acquired, though when and how he managed that remains a matter of considerable Imperial classification. The point of all this dynastic variation is that a crown world is not just a military installation. It is the expression of a personality, writ large in metal and ancient power. What the character of the ruling pharaoh and the historical experiences of the dynasty are inseparable from the physical reality of what the world is and what it does. The crown world of Mandragora is the home of calculated, relentless military expansion, because that is who Imhotep is and what the Sautek have decided they are. The crown world of Solemnace is the home of one of the galaxy's most eccentric archivists, because that is what Trazyn decided his immortality was for. And across all of them, just beneath all the dynastic variation, runs the same fundamental current, 60 million years of preserved purpose, now unleashed into a galaxy that did not know they were coming and does not have adequate frameworks to respond to what they represent. Part 10. The Long View. What the Crown World truly means. We have spent a long time in these ancient halls and deep corridors, and before we surface, I want to look at what the existence of a Necron Crown World actually means, not just in tactical or military terms, but in the deepest sense of what it represents, about the universe of Warhammer 40,000, and about the nature of the beings who inhabit it. The Crown World is, above everything else, an argument, a continuous 60 million year argument being made in metal and silence by a civilization that refused to accept the endings that are the ordinary lot of organic species. The Necrons looked at death, their personal deaths, their civilizational death, the death that the Old One's refusal and the galaxy's indifference seemed to promise them, and they said no. They paid a price that is almost impossible to calculate for saying no. But they said it. And here they are. Every warrior that steps out of a Crown World's vaults in the 41st millennium is, in some small way, a rebuttal to the idea that civilizations end inevitably. They do not have to end, not necessarily. Not inevitably. They can be preserved across timescales that make the entire history of human civilization look like an afternoon. They can wait. They can endure. They can outlast everything that was set against them. The cost of this endurance is what makes the Necrons so philosophically interesting as a faction. They are not simply ancient and powerful. The galaxy has other ancient and powerful things. What makes them unique is the nature of the price they paid. A people who wanted to live forever got exactly what they asked for and found that what they received was not what they had wanted. The immortality is real. The souls are gone. The warmth is gone. The spontaneity and joy and connection that make a long life feel worth living rather than merely endured. These are the things that were traded away in the bio-furnaces 60 million years ago, and they have not come back. The most ancient Necrons on the most ancient crown worlds carry, in the very deepest architecture of their engrams, the faintest traces of what was lost. Memories of organic sensation that have no context in their current existence. The dim impression of what warmth felt like on biological skin, of what food tasted like, of what laughter sounded like when it came from the chest rather than being calculated from processing. These ghosts surface occasionally, in unguarded processing moments, as anomalies their systems cannot quite categorize, data points that don't connect to anything in their current frame of reference. It is the after-image of a soul, the shadow of what was burned away in the furnaces. And it sits there, in the deep architecture of the most ancient Necron minds, like the warmth of a light that was put out millions of years ago, and whose fading trace can still, if the conditions are exactly right, just barely be felt. There is a particular quality to how Necron nobles of the Crown World class inhabit their existence in the current era that is worth pausing on, because it does not map cleanly onto any simpler template of villain or conqueror or tragic monster. The overlord who stands in their gleaming hall and commands armies that have not taken the field in 60 million years is not simply powerful. They are, in a very particular and rarely articulated way, profoundly alone. Not in the trivial sense of social isolation. They are surrounded by their court, their warriors, their cryptech advisors, the constant activity of a political and military machine rebuilding itself. They are alone in the sense that no other living being in the galaxy shares their frame of reference. Every species they encounter now is, by their experiential reckoning, impossibly young. The oldest human civilizations trace their lineages back perhaps 12,000 years. The Eldari can claim a longer history in their scattered craft-world communities, but the great Eldari Empire, the thing that actually makes them comparable to the Necrontyrs era, ended in the fall, and the survivors carry that civilization's memory as trauma rather than continuity. The Tau are barely a blip, their spacefaring civilization only a few thousand years old. Even the Orcs, who have been seeded across the galaxy for as long as anyone can track, and operate without the institutional memory that the Necrons maintain. The Necron overlord in their court has no peers in the most literal possible sense. Everyone around them is, by the experiential calculus that actually shapes perspective, a child. And the overlord has been carrying the weight of what they know for 60 million years, without the natural processing mechanism that organic death eventually provides. The mercy of not having to keep carrying it forever. This is not self-pity. It is important to be clear about that. The most capable Necron nobles do not experience their situation as pitiable, and they would find the suggestion offensive in ways that would have tactical consequences. What they experience is something closer to the cold certainty of deep experience, the knowledge that they have outlasted everything, that their perspective on the galaxy is simply longer and therefore more comprehensive than any rival perspective that any current species can offer, and that this comprehensive perspective is both their greatest strategic asset and the thing that makes genuine connection with any other living being essentially impossible. There is a cryptech tradition, rarely discussed openly but documented in fragments recovered from Tomb World archives, of constructing what the Necrontyre once called memory tablets. Physical objects, typically fashioned from a crystalline substrate capable of high-density data storage, on which specific emotional memories are encoded directly from the engrams of their creator, not the tactical record of an event, not the factual accounting, the feeling. Whatever limited version of feeling the Necron's converted consciousness can access. The moment before a great battle. The specific quality of light, remembered from biological life 60 million years ago. Air surfacing as a phantom data signature in the mechanical architecture of the mind. The way the light fell on the Necrontyre homeworld at the end of a long day. The particular character of grief experienced when someone was lost, encoded in whatever mechanical analogue of grief a Necron mind produces. These tablets are kept private. They are never displayed. In many cases, they are probably never deliberately accessed. The cryptech who made them sealed the memory away and has not opened it since. But they are not destroyed. The act of making them and the act of keeping them says something about the Necron condition that no amount of formal dynastic proclamation or military posturing can articulate, that even a mind which has been stripped of its capacity for full organic emotional experience still reaches, in whatever reduced and indirect way is available to it, for the things it can barely remember once having. As different Necrons answer the question of whether all this was worth it differently, and those answers shape who they are at the deepest level. The Destroyers, in their broken and terrible way, have effectively answered no, and the consequences of that answer are written all over them. Some of the greatest nobles have effectively answered yes, and find in power and longevity and dynastic ambition something that serves, if not as happiness, then at least as purpose. And some carry the question unresolved, in the faint impressions of what they once were, as a problem that 60 million years has not solved, and that may never be. The Silent King's own answer to this question, the answer of Sarek, the being who more than any other carries personal responsibility for what his people became, is the most significant and the most uncertain. When he has returned from his exile, carrying the awareness that biotransference may have been the greatest mistake any ruler in galactic history ever made. He gave the order, he sealed the bargain, he watched the biofurnaces consume the souls of his entire civilization, and he understood what he had done while they were still dying. He has spent 60 million years in the empty spaces between galaxies, reckoning with that understanding. What he has decided, on the basis of that reckoning, is that the Necrontyre, the Necrons, deserve the chance to find out whether it is possible to undo even a little of what was done, whether the reversal of biotransference is possible, whether souls that were consumed by star gods before those star gods were shattered can, in any form, be recovered or regenerated, whether the answer to 60 million years of hollow immortality might be, against all probability, something other than simply enduring it forever. This project, Sarek's project, the goal that brought him back across the intergalactic void after 60 million years of exile, is not, strictly speaking, a military objective in the conventional sense. It does not conquer worlds or eliminate threats or accumulate territory. What it does, if it succeeds, is change the fundamental nature of what the Necrons are. Or it transforms the Crown World from a monument to the price of immortality into something else entirely, the base from which something genuinely unprecedented is attempted. The reversal, in some form, of a decision that was made 60 million years ago and was supposed to be irreversible. Whether that project succeeds or fails is not yet written. The Warhammer 40,000 setting, as of the most recent lore developments, leaves it genuinely open. The Necrons are building their empire. The Silent King is pursuing his agenda. The other factions of the galaxy are variously cooperating with, fighting against, or simply trying to survive contact with the awakening dead. The outcome is not predetermined, but the Crown World holds all of these possibilities simultaneously, in its deepest halls, in the chambers of the greatest nobles, in the archival vaults of the cryptex, in the maintenance corridors where the scarabs run their endless circuits, and in the peripheral territories where the destroyer cults and the flayed ones maintain their terrible presence. All of it is a single continuous story about a species that made one catastrophic, irreversible decision 60-odd million years ago, and has been living with the consequences ever since. And in the current era of the 41st millennium, is beginning, perhaps for the first time, to dare to ask whether consequences can be changed. The Imperium of man is 10,000 years old, and considers itself ancient. The Eldari Empire at its height spanned tens of thousands of years. The Necrons, as a civilization, were a galactic power before either of those things existed in any form whatsoever. They remember a galaxy that nobody else alive has any reference point for. They operate on a timeline that makes the entire history of human civilization look like a single morning. The most ancient Necron crown world in Warhammer 40,000 is not simply a game mechanic or a dramatic backdrop. It is a monument to the price of refusing to end. It is evidence that something can persist across incomprehensible spans of time. It is a place where the past and the present exist simultaneously, where a pharaoh can look at their own reflection in the living metal walls and see an entity that is the direct continuation of something that walked the galaxy when humanity's evolutionary ancestors were early primates that had not yet developed stone tools. It is the loneliest place in the galaxy, and it is, in its cold and particular way, one of the most magnificent things that the Warhammer 40,000 universe has produced. A palace of the dead that has outlasted everything, including, as in many meaningful ways, the beings who built it. Consider what it means to walk those halls, if you could. Consider what it means to stand in a corridor that has not hosted a living being in the biological sense for 60 million years, and look down its length at the green-lit geometry of a civilization that should not still exist. The scarabs moving in their rivers through the walls around you, at the deep hum of systems that have been running without interruption since before the formation of Earth's mountain ranges. The stasis crypts somewhere beneath your feet, the warriors locked in their frozen near death, waiting for a signal that has been running through their bodies as a quantum carrier wave for geological epochs. And then the sense, very quiet and very certain, that somewhere ahead in the dark, something has detected your presence, something that has been here the whole time, something patient in a way that goes so far beyond the ordinary meaning of the word, that the word itself barely applies anymore. The lights are on, the sleepers are waking, and the galaxy, which has been moving on without them for 60 million years, is about to be reminded that the most ancient things do not always remain asleep. At Part 10, B, the caged gods, Citan shards, and the power beneath the vaults. There is one more thing that lives within certain crown worlds, a presence so dangerous and so strategically significant that even the most powerful pharaoh only speaks of it in carefully controlled contexts, with careful language, in situations where the wrong word could have consequences reaching far beyond political embarrassment. The Citan, not the full gods, those were shattered long ago, reduced from their universe-spanning divine state into fragments of varying size and power during the final act of the war in heaven when the Necrons turned on their former patrons. But the shards that resulted from that shattering are not nothing. A Citan shard is a fragment of a star god, a being of living energy that fed on the output of stars. That consumed the souls of an entire civilization in the biofurnaces and used that psychic fuel to reshape itself into a form capable of fighting in the material dimension. Even reduced by the process of shattering to a fraction of its original power, a Citan shard retains capabilities that are genuinely godlike by any conventional measure. The Necrons who made the decision to shatter the Citan, rather than attempting to destroy them completely, understood something about the physics involved. Its complete destruction of a Citan would have released energy on a scale difficult to contain. A shattering, by contrast, could be managed. The fragments could be captured, bound within tesseract labyrinths, and contained. And once contained, the shards became something unprecedented in the galaxy's history: imprisoned gods. The tesseract labyrinth is one of the most remarkable pieces of Necron engineering in existence, which is saying something given the overall level of what Necron engineering can achieve. It is, at its most basic physical level, a small geometric container, typically about the size that could rest in a large hand. Inside it, the physics of space and time are folded and refolded in configurations that generate what is effectively a pocket dimension of enormous internal volume. Of the Catan shard, imprisoned within experiences that pocket dimension as a complete reality. There is space to move in. There is time passing. There is the full experiential content of a contained world. But the boundaries of that world are the walls of the labyrinth, and those walls are constructed from materials and maintained by field geometries that even a fragment of a star god cannot tear through from the inside. The crown worlds that house Catan shards in Tesseract labyrinths are, whilst therefore doing something that no other civilization in the history of the galaxy has accomplished, maintaining the ability to weaponize gods. When a Pharaon fields a Catan shard on the battlefield, what they are actually doing is temporarily releasing the labyrinth's containment and allowing the shard to operate in the material dimension under circumstances carefully structured to minimize the risk of that temporary release becoming permanent. The shard is released toward an enemy formation, brings to bear whatever specific fragment of its former divine power it still retains, and is then recaptured before it can develop the capacity to reassert genuine independence. The nature of what each shard retains varies, and is a function of which Catan, the original being, was, and which specific capacities were encoded in the portion of its consciousness that the particular shard represents. The outsider. The Catan, whose most notable characteristic was a madness so profound and so alien that even the other Catan found it disturbing, produced shards whose insanity is contained within the labyrinths and occasionally deployed in situations where the capacity to generate sheer psychological horror in an enemy force is tactically useful. Child the Void Dragon, whose dominion extended over metal and machinery and the fundamental physics of material construction, produced shards that retain an ability to interact with mechanical systems in ways that are, from the outside, indistinguishable from a machine spirit of terrifying power, waking up angry inside your own equipment. The Deceiver produced shards that are the most dangerous of all to handle, because the Deceiver's essential nature was manipulation, the capacity to generate perceptions and beliefs in other minds that served the Deceiver's purposes. A shard of the Deceiver, even bound in a Tesseract labyrinth, is always thinking, always probing, always assessing whether the specific configuration of circumstances it currently finds itself in has created a window, however narrow, for the kind of influence that could gradually, over a very long time, produce something like freedom. Every Necron who handles a Deceiver shard is aware of this. Every Cryptek who maintains the labyrinth's containment fields knows that the thing inside is not passive. The question of whether any specific shard of the Deceiver has, at any point in the last 60 million years, managed to exert meaningful influence on the mind of a Necron who came into sustained contact with it, is one that the Necron nobility does not discuss openly, partly out of political prudence, and partly because the honest answer might be unsettling. On a crown world, Catan shards held in labyrinths are stored in the deepest and most isolated section of the tomb complex. The vault beneath the vault. The chamber behind the locked door behind the locked door. The Crypteks who maintain the containment systems work in pairs, never alone, and are subject to periodic cognitive assessments that test for any anomalous processing patterns that might suggest external influence. The power systems that maintain the labyrinths are redundant to a degree far exceeding anything else in the tomb. Multiple independent loops, each capable of maintaining containment alone, so that the simultaneous failure of any combination, short of all of them at once, cannot produce an uncontrolled release. And the shards know they are there. This is not a metaphor. A Catan shard is a conscious being of genuine intelligence, however alien its nature. It experiences its imprisonment, and it is aware of the passage of time, 60 million years of it, in many cases. It thinks in whatever way a fragment of a star god thinks, and in those 60 million years of confinement within its labyrinth, it has had nothing else to do. The Necron overlords who deploy these creatures in battle do so with a particular kind of cold pragmatism that is characteristic of the Necron relationship with power in general. The Catan were betrayers who consumed the souls of the Necrontire. They deserved their imprisonment. They are also extraordinarily powerful weapons who can be pointed at enemies in ways that provide battlefield effects. Nothing else in the Crown World's arsenal can produce. Both of these things are true simultaneously, and the Necron approach to this situation is to simply hold both truths in mind at once and proceed accordingly. Whether the Citan shards, after 60 million years of contemplation inside their labyrinths, or have developed perspectives on their situation that might eventually produce complications for their Necron captors, is another question that the cryptex prefer to track through careful measurement rather than direct inquiry. You do not ask a caged god what it is thinking. You watch the containment field readings, maintain the redundant power loops, conduct your cognitive assessments, and make very sure that your labyrinth's geometry is operating within specified parameters. As for those parameters, if they failed, if the field geometries that fold the pocket dimension began to unravel, would release something into the physical reality of the Crown World that even a fully awakened Pharaon commanding billions of Necron warriors would struggle to address. Not destroy, not command. Survive if the response was sufficiently immediate and the shard in question was among the less powerful examples. This is another thing that the Crown World carries within itself. Alongside the destroyer cults and the flayed ones and the severed and the ancient grudges of the royal court, the most ancient tomb worlds, the crown worlds that predate everything else in the dynasty structure, are in some cases the ones most likely to have the most significant Citan shard collections, because their pharaons were among the most powerful at the time of the Great Sleep, and the most powerful pharaons took custody of the most significant shards. As the gallery of caged gods beneath the deepest level of the Crown World's vaults is, therefore, not just a weapons stockpile. It is a reminder maintained in living form across 60 million years of who the Necrons were when they were mortal, of what they agreed to in their desperation, of what was done to them in the furnaces, and of the fact that the beings who did it are still here, still present, still conscious, still thinking behind the walls of their labyrinths, is still waiting, in whatever alien fashion a fragment of a star god waits, for a change in circumstances that might not be coming, but has not yet been definitively foreclosed. It is the most complicated relationship in the Warhammer 40,000 galaxy. It is a civilization perpetually in the presence of its greatest trauma, managing that presence with cold engineering genius and the particular kind of determination that comes from having decided 60 million years ago that survival was worth any cost. Closing thoughts. That brings us to the end of tonight's journey through the deep halls and ancient crypts of the Necron Crown World. We have come a long way, from the irradiated homeworld of the Necrontier to the bio-furnaces of biotransference, through the war in heaven and the Great Sleep, into the architecture of the tombs themselves and the systems that kept them alive, through the hierarchy and politics and madnesses of the beings who inhabit them, and finally, out into the awakening that is reshaping the galaxy of the 41st millennium. It is worth sitting with what we have actually been through tonight, because when you lay it all out like this, when you follow the Necrontyre from their dying sun all the way to the 41st millennium's slowly reawakening tombs, the scale of the story is something that does not have many real parallels anywhere in science fiction or fantasy. Well, this is not a story about an ancient evil threatening a young civilization. It is a story about something far more complicated and far more human, in a strange way, than that simple frame can hold. It is a story about suffering and the desperate measures suffering produces, about the way that getting exactly what you wanted can be the cruelest possible outcome, about the things that persist across time and the things that are lost despite every effort to preserve them. The Necrontyre wanted to live. That was all. They looked at death, their own constant radiation-poisoned death, and they wanted it to stop. They looked at beings who did not have to die the way they died and asked for help, and when that help was refused, they found another way, and the other way they found was the worst possible version of what they had asked for. Immortality without what makes life worth living. Survival without the self. And yet here they are, 60 million years later, is still refusing to be gone, still operating within the frameworks they built before the Great Sleep, still nursing the same grudges, pursuing the same dynastic ambitions, maintaining the same political structures and martial traditions, carrying in their failing organic engrams the last fading echoes of what it once felt like to be alive. The stubbornness of it is almost admirable. The tragedy of it sits quietly at the center of everything they are. The Crown World is the physical expression of that stubbornness and that tragedy simultaneously. A monument built by a people who refused to end, maintained for 60 million years by systems that never stopped working, waiting in patient mechanical silence for the return of beings that it has kept perfectly preserved against every form of entropy that time could throw at it. It is a tomb that is not a tomb, a palace that is not quite a palace, a sleeping empire that is slowly, but irreversibly waking up. The next time you look at a Necron army on a tabletop or read a Warhammer 40k novel where the Silver Warriors rise from their crypts or encounter these ancient civilizations in any of the game's materials, I hope this sits with you. The green light in the empty hall, the scarabs moving through walls unchanged since before humanity existed, the Overlord stepping out of their sarcophagus and looking at a galaxy 60 million years removed from the one they remember, yet with eyes that carry the weight of everything described tonight, adjusting their targeting systems and beginning to rebuild what was theirs. They were here before us. By any measure that matters, they will be here after us. And the galaxy they are returning to, fractured and burning and magnificent in its chaos, has no idea yet what it means that the most ancient civilization in its history has opened its eyes again and decided that 60 million years was long enough to wait. That patience is itself a kind of power, one the rest of the galaxy is only now beginning to comprehend. I hope this gave you something real, not just information, but a genuine sense of what these places feel like, what they represent, and why they matter as one of the most philosophically rich corners of the entire Warhammer 40,000 setting. Because the Necrons are not just cool robot space skeletons, though they are absolutely that as well. And they are a civilization's answer to the hardest question any civilization can face. What would you give up to survive? And they are living, or not living technically, with the answer. If you made it all the way to the end of this one, you are exactly why I make this channel. Thank you, genuinely. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button. It genuinely helps this kind of long-form lore content reach other people who would appreciate it. And if you want to be here the next time we go somewhere like this, somewhere ancient and atmospheric and full of things worth knowing, please subscribe to Q on 40k and make sure your notifications are on so you don't miss it. Until next time, I will see you in the dark between the stars.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.